Supercommunicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection by Charles Duhigg. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling completely misunderstood? Or maybe you were on the other side, trying your best to listen, to offer advice, to connect with someone you care about, but no matter what you said, it just made things worse. You said, "Don't worry, it'll be fine," and they heard, "Your feelings don't matter." You offered a solution, and they heard, "You're not smart enough to fix this yourself." You tried to be empathetic, and they heard, "You're just pretending to care." These moments of miscommunication are more than just frustrating. They're painful. They can damage our relationships, stall our careers, and leave us feeling lonely and isolated in a world that's more connected, yet somehow more divided than ever before. But what if there's a secret language of connection? A set of hidden rules that govern every single human interaction, from high-stakes negotiations to quiet chats with your best friend. A language that some people, the supercommunicators, seem to know instinctively. They're the ones who can walk into any room and make people feel heard, understood, and valued. They're the friends you call when you have a problem, the colleagues who lead without authority, the people who can effortlessly bridge divides and turn conflict into connection. Here's the most exciting part. This isn't a superpower they were born with. It's a skill, and it's a skill you can learn. Today, we're diving deep into the work of Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Charles Duhigg. He's the mind behind the international bestseller, The Power of Habit, a book that has sold over 10 million copies and changed the way we think about human behavior. But after years of studying habits, Duhigg turned his attention to an even more fundamental question: what makes a good conversation actually work? He spent years interviewing people from every imaginable background: intelligence officers, top neuroscientists, the creators of hit TV shows, even psychologists who select astronauts for long missions, all to unravel this mystery. The result is his groundbreaking book, Supercommunicators. And I promise you this: by the end of our time together, you'll understand the 3 hidden conversations that are happening underneath every single discussion you have. You'll learn the simple framework that supercommunicators use to connect with anyone in any situation. And you'll walk away with a new understanding of the most important skill you can ever master: the art of true human connection. So let's begin with a story that has all the makings of a thriller. It's about a young intelligence officer, a secret mission, and a conversation that had to succeed, or his career, and perhaps someone's life, would be lost. Imagine you're in your early 30s, and you've landed your dream job. You're a case officer for the intelligence service. But there's a problem: you're terrible at it. This was the reality for a young man named Jim Lawler. It was the early 1980s, and his one job was to recruit spies, to build trust with foreign officials, and convince them to share their country's secrets. But after months of trying, he had nothing to show for it but a series of embarrassing failures. He once tried to recruit a woman who, it turned out, was trying to recruit him for the other side. His career was on the line. Then, a breakthrough. A young woman named Yasmin, who worked in the foreign ministry of a country hostile to the United States, was visiting Europe. She was lonely, disillusioned with her government's oppressive regime, and she needed money. Lawler, posing as an oil speculator, befriended her. He offered her a part-time consulting gig, a cover for their real work. She was overjoyed. He had done it. He had recruited his first spy. But then his boss gave him an order that made his blood run cold. "Now you need to tell her who you really are." Lawler knew it was a terrible idea. Yasmin had to understand the risks she was taking. Her government executed people for treason. But if he told her the truth, she would almost certainly run. Over a tense dinner, he confessed. He wasn't an oil man. He was an American intelligence officer. He told her his government wanted the same thing she did: to weaken her country's oppressive leaders. He apologized for lying, and he asked her to work with him. As he spoke, he watched the color drain from her face. Her eyes grew wide with terror. She started shaking her head, whispering, "No, no, no," and then the tears came. She told him they murdered people for what he was asking. There was no way she could help. And then she fled. Lawler was crushed. His one chance, his entire career, was gone. He knew he had, at most, one more opportunity to talk to her. But how could he possibly convince her to trust him? How do you create a genuine connection with someone who sees you as a threat? This question is the very heart of Charles Duhigg's work in Supercommunicators. Because what Jim Lawler was facing is a problem we all face, just usually with lower stakes. How do you connect with a boss who seems distant? A friend who's pulling away? A family member you just can't seem to understand? For decades, scientists have been studying this very question, and they've discovered something remarkable. When two people truly click, something incredible happens in their brains. Their neural patterns begin to synchronize. They enter a state of what scientists call neural entrainment. Their breathing rates can match, their heartbeats align, and they start to anticipate each other's thoughts. It's as if, for a moment, they're sharing one mind. This isn't just some poetic metaphor. It's a biological reality. Our brains are wired to crave this connection. It's an evolutionary instinct that helped our ancestors form tribes, protect each other, and survive. When we connect, it feels wonderful. And when we fail to connect, it's deeply unsettling. Some people, the supercommunicators, seem to achieve this neural entrainment effortlessly. They're masters of connection. But why? What are they doing differently? To find out, researchers at Dartmouth conducted a fascinating experiment. They gathered volunteers, put them in brain scanners, and showed them confusing silent movie clips. At first, every person's brain activity was completely different. They were all having their own unique experience. But then, the researchers put the volunteers into small groups and asked them to discuss what they had seen. After an hour of conversation, they put them back in the scanners and showed them the same clips again. This time, something had changed. The brain activity of the people within each group had started to synchronize. The act of talking had literally caused their minds to align. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some groups became far more synchronized than others. Their brain scans looked almost identical. Why? The researchers discovered that the most synchronized groups all had one thing in common, a person they called a, quote, high centrality participant. We would call them a supercommunicator. Now, you might think this person was a dominant leader, the one who talked the most, but it was the exact opposite. The groups with a dominant, talkative leader showed the least amount of brain synchrony. The supercommunicators were different. They often spoke less. When they did speak, it was usually to ask questions. They were constantly inviting others into the conversation. They'd say things like, "That's a really interesting point. Tell me more about that." They would repeat back what others had said to show they were listening. They laughed easily and weren't afraid to admit when they were confused. But their most important skill was something Duhigg calls the matching principle. Supercommunicators are experts at subtly matching the people they're talking to. If someone became serious, they matched that seriousness. If the conversation turned lighthearted, they were the first to play along. They weren't just mimicking. They were attuning themselves to the emotional and conversational frequency of the other person, and in doing so, they created an environment of trust where everyone felt safe to speak up. They made it easy for everyone's brains to sync up. This leads us to the single most important framework in the entire book. Duhigg reveals that most of our communication failures happen for one simple reason. We think we're having one conversation, but we're actually having one of three. And if we're not on the same wavelength as the person we're talking to, we're never going to connect. Every discussion we have is really three different conversations happening at once. The first is the "what's this really about" conversation. This is the practical, decision-making, problem-solving conversation. It's about logistics, plans, and figuring out what we want. When you're debating where to go for dinner or how to solve a problem at work, you're in this type of conversation. It's logical and analytical. The second is the "how do we feel" conversation. This is the emotional conversation. It's not about finding solutions. It's about sharing feelings, seeking empathy, and understanding each other's emotional state. When a friend calls you to vent about their terrible day, they're not looking for a 10-point plan. They're inviting you into an emotional conversation. They just want to feel heard. And the third is the who are we conversation. This is the social conversation, and it's about our identities and relationships. It's about how we see ourselves and how we relate to others. When we talk about our backgrounds, our shared friends, our values, or how our different experiences, like our race, gender, or upbringing, shape our perspectives, we're in a who are we conversation. Think of these three conversations like different radio stations. If you're trying to have a practical, problem-solving conversation tuned to the "what's this really about" station, while your partner is trying to have an emotional conversation tuned to the "how do we feel" station, you're just going to get static. You'll talk past each other. This was exactly the mistake Charles Duhigg himself made when he first became a manager. A colleague came to him, frustrated, saying she felt her contributions were being ignored. She was trying to start an emotional conversation. She needed empathy, but Duhigg immediately jumped into problem-solving mode, suggesting new organizational charts and meeting structures. He was on the wrong frequency. His colleague finally interrupted him, saying, "You're not listening to me. We need to do a better job of respecting each other." She wanted to talk about feelings. He was stuck on practical fixes. They couldn't connect because they weren't having the same conversation. Supercommunicators understand this instinctively. They're masters at identifying which of the three conversations is happening at any given moment and matching that frequency. So how do we learn to do this? Let's break down each conversation, one by one. First, let's tackle the "what's this really about" conversation. This is the realm of negotiation, but not in the way you might think. Duhigg says that every conversation is a negotiation. The prize isn't winning an argument. The prize is figuring out what everyone actually wants. He tells the powerful story of Dr. Bayfar Edeye, a top cancer surgeon at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Dr. Edeye specialized in prostate cancer. For most men with low-risk tumors, the best course of action is active surveillance, basically watching and waiting, because the treatment is often worse than the disease, causing lifelong issues like impotence and incontinence. Dr. Edeye would sit down with his patients, lay out all the data, show them studies highlighted in yellow, and explain logically why surgery was a bad idea. He thought these would be easy conversations. He was telling them they could avoid a risky operation. But again and again, his patients would ignore his advice and insist on the surgery. He was bewildered. He was the expert, armed with facts and reason. But he was failing to connect. Why? He was having a "what's this really about" conversation, focused on medical data. But his patients were having a completely different conversation. They were asking themselves, "Am I willing to risk dying? What will my family think? How do I deal with the fear of having cancer inside me?" Their conversation was deeply emotional and tied to their identity. Dr. Edeye learned to change his approach. Instead of starting with data, he started with a simple, open-ended question: "What does this cancer diagnosis mean to you?" Suddenly, everything changed. Patients didn't talk about statistics. They talked about their families, their fears, their hopes for retirement. One man talked about his father dying young and not wanting to put his own family through that. Dr. Edeye realized what the conversation was really about. For this man, it wasn't about the 3% risk of metastasis. It was about protecting his family from worry. Once Dr. Edeye understood what the man truly wanted, to make the decision that would cause his family the least amount of stress, he could frame the options in a way that truly connected. Within 6 months of changing his approach, the number of his patients choosing unnecessary surgery dropped by 30%. He stopped assuming he knew what the conversation was about and started asking. This conversation also involves two different types of logic. Sometimes we use the logic of costs and benefits, a rational, analytical approach. But other times we use the logic of similarities. This is an empathetic, story-driven logic, where we make decisions based on our values and past experiences. What does someone like me do in a situation like this? Supercommunicators know which logic to use. If someone is telling you a story full of emotion, responding with a spreadsheet of data is a guaranteed way to fail. You need to match their logic. This brings us to the second, and perhaps most important type of conversation, the how do we feel conversation. This is where true connection is forged. It's about vulnerability. But talking about our feelings, especially with strangers or colleagues, can feel awkward and risky. So how do we do it? Duhigg tells the story of psychologist Nick Epley, who learned the hard way. As a teenager, Epley was a classic jock who got pulled over twice for drunk driving. Both times, the cops and his parents lectured him. They tried, quote, perspective taking. They said, "We understand what it's like to be a teenager," but their lectures washed right over him. He didn't listen. Then, he went to a counselor. But she didn't lecture him at all. She just asked questions. Why were you drinking? How would you have reacted if your car had hit someone? What would happen to your life if you had killed another person? These questions weren't explicitly about his emotions, but they forced him to confront them. They pushed him to talk about his beliefs, his fears, his values. It was in answering those questions that he finally understood himself and was ready to change. The counselor wasn't taking his perspective. She was getting his perspective. And that is the key. You can't truly know what someone else is feeling by imagining it. You have to ask. This is why the famous 36 questions that lead to love study is so powerful. Researchers found they could make two complete strangers feel a deep sense of closeness in under an hour, simply by having them ask and answer a series of escalatingly personal questions. The questions worked because they invited vulnerability and reciprocity. When you ask someone a deep question, not "where do you work," but "what's the best part of your job," you're not just asking for a fact. You're asking for a piece of their inner world, their values, their passions, their experiences. You're inviting vulnerability. And when they answer, a magical thing happens. It creates an opening for you to share something vulnerable in return. This back and forth of vulnerability triggers what scientists call emotional contagion. We start to feel what the other person is feeling, and our brains begin to sync up. But how do you hear emotions when no one says them aloud? This is where the fascinating story of the Big Bang Theory comes in. The original pilot for the show was a complete disaster. Test audiences hated it. The problem was that the characters, Sheldon, Leonard, and their friends, were designed to be emotionally clueless. They were brilliant physicists who were terrible at expressing their feelings. But a sitcom only works if the audience knows what the characters are feeling, even when they don't say it. The writers, Chuck Lorre and Bill Prady, were stuck. How do you show emotion with characters who can't show emotion? They cracked the code when they rewrote the pilot and introduced the character Penny. In the first scene where Sheldon and Leonard meet her, the conversation is just one word, repeated over and over. Penny, bright and cheerful, says, "Oh, hi." Leonard, suddenly anxious, says, "Hi." Sheldon, utterly uncertain, says, "Hi." Leonard, now panicking, says, "Hi." The words are the same, but the emotions are completely different. The actors were matching each other's volume and speed, their energy, but their tone and expression, their mood, were wildly different. And it was hilarious. The audience instantly understood. These guys are awkward, they're nervous, but they desperately want to connect. Duhigg explains that our brains are constantly, and unconsciously, scanning for two nonverbal cues in others: mood, positive or negative, and energy, high or low. Is someone upbeat or glum? Are they agitated and loud or calm and quiet? Supercommunicators are brilliant at this. They don't just hear the words. They hear the music behind the words. They notice someone's mood and energy, and they match it. If a friend is telling a story with high energy and a positive mood, you don't respond with a low energy mumble. You match their excitement. That's how you show them, non-verbally, "I hear you, I'm with you." This was the secret a psychiatrist named Terrence McGuire discovered when screening astronaut candidates for long-term space missions. Living in a tiny capsule for months on end requires exceptional emotional intelligence. McGuire found he could identify the best candidates by paying attention to how they laughed. When he laughed, did the candidate laugh with the same energy and mood, or was their laugh forced and out of sync? The ones who could naturally match his emotional energy were the ones who had the right stuff to build connections under pressure. Finally, we come to the third, and often the hardest, type of conversation, the who are we conversation. This is about our identities, our race, gender, background, politics, and values. These conversations are hard because they can feel threatening. When we talk about our differences, we risk saying the wrong thing, being misunderstood, or offending someone. And we risk having our own identity attacked. Duhigg shares a powerful story about an experiment designed to see if people on opposite sides of America's most divisive issue, gun control, could have a civil conversation. Organizers brought together passionate gun rights advocates and dedicated gun control activists. They knew that a standard debate would just end in a shouting match. So they did something different. Before anyone talked about policy, they taught them a simple technique called looping for understanding. It has 3 steps. 1. Ask a genuine, curious question to understand someone's perspective. 2. Repeat back, in your own words, what you just heard them say. 3. Ask, did I get that right? This simple loop is incredibly powerful. It's not about agreeing, it's about proving that you are listening. When you can accurately summarize someone else's viewpoint, especially someone you disagree with, you send a powerful message. I am trying to understand you. This creates a sense of psychological safety. It makes people feel heard, and when people feel heard, they become less defensive and more willing to listen in return. The organizers then asked everyone to share a personal story about why the issue of guns was so important to them. Instead of debating statistics, they told stories about fear, family, and safety. A woman described being assaulted and how owning a gun made her feel powerful again. Melanie Jeffcoat, a gun control activist haunted by a school shooting she survived as a teen, told her story. As they listened and looped, something shifted. They didn't change their minds about gun laws, but they began to see the humanity in each other. They found common emotional ground. Jeffcoat said, it made me feel naive, like I had just assumed all gun owners were the same angry white guys I saw at rallies. They had found a way to connect, even amid profound conflict. These identity conversations are also where we have to confront stereotypes. Duhigg explains the concept of stereotype threat, discovered by psychologist Claude Steele. Steele found that when a negative stereotype exists about a group's abilities, for example, the stereotype that women are not as good at math, it can actually undermine the performance of people in that group. In his experiments, highly talented female math students would score lower than their male peers on a difficult math test, simply because the awareness of the stereotype created a subtle anxiety that used up precious mental energy. But he also found a powerful antidote. When he reminded the women of their multiple identities, that they were not just a woman taking a math test, but also a sister, an athlete, a volunteer, a leader in the chess club, the effect of the stereotype threat vanished. They performed just as well as the men. This is a profound lesson for all of us. We are not one-dimensional, we all contain multitudes. In a who are we conversation, especially a difficult one, the key is to draw out those multiple identities. Don't let one single label, liberal, conservative, doctor, patient, define the entire conversation. Look for the other identities you share. You might be a doctor, and they might be vaccine skeptical, but you might both be worried parents who just want what's best for your kids. That shared identity is the bridge you can use to connect. This is exactly what Dr. Jay Rosenblum, a pediatrician, learned to do with parents who were hesitant about vaccines. Instead of arguing with data, he'd start by finding common ground. He'd ask about their families, their neighborhood, their hopes for their children. He would remind himself and them that they were both parents. By shifting the conversation from expert versus skeptic to, quote, parent to parent, He created an environment of trust where a real dialogue could finally begin. And this brings us back to our intelligence officer Jim Lawler sitting across from Yasmin at their final desperate dinner. He had tried everything. He'd tried being friendly. He'd tried being logical. He'd tried appealing to her values. Nothing had worked. She was sad, discouraged, and about to fly home, her dreams of a different life seemingly crushed. In that quiet, desperate moment, Lawler finally stopped trying to be a spy. He stopped trying to be a smooth operator. He just became a person. He started talking about how he felt. He told her he was worried he wasn't cut out for this life. He told her about his failures, his fears, his feelings of being an imposter. He shared his own vulnerability. He wasn't trying to be manipulative. He had given up. He was just being honest. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, something changed. Yasmin saw that he was just as uncertain as she was. She felt safe with him. She understood him. And she felt, for the first time, truly heard. "I can help you," she said. Yasmin went on to become one of the most valuable assets in the region for the next 2 decades. Their connection, forged in a moment of honest emotional and identity-bearing conversation, changed everything. That is the power of a supercommunicator. It's not about having all the right words. It's about knowing which conversation you're in. It's about proving you're listening. It's about being brave enough to be vulnerable. And it's about remembering that, underneath all our differences, we are all just people, looking to connect. There's a famous, long-running study at Harvard University that has followed the lives of over 2,000 people for more than 80 years. It's one of the most comprehensive studies of human life ever conducted. It has tracked these individuals from their teenage years into old age, examining their health, their careers, their happiness, everything. And after all those decades of research, all that data, the single clearest message from the study is this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier. Period. It wasn't their wealth, their fame, or their cholesterol levels at age 50 that best predicted how they would age. It was the quality of their relationships. The people who were the most satisfied in their relationships at age 50 were the healthiest at age 80. Think about that for a second. The single most important ingredient for a long, happy, and healthy life isn't something you can buy or achieve or inherit. It's something you build, conversation by conversation, day by day. It's the quality of your connections with other people. And that is why Charles Duhigg's Supercommunicators is such an important book. It's not just a collection of interesting tips for better small talk. It is a manual for building a better life. It gives us the tools to forge the deep, meaningful connections that our brains crave and our well-being depends on. The lessons in this book are simple, but they are not easy. It takes courage to be vulnerable. It takes discipline to truly listen, to prove you're listening, especially when you disagree. It takes awareness to recognize which of the 3 conversations you're in, and to have the flexibility to match the other person's frequency. But the beautiful thing is that these are skills. They can be practiced. You can start today. The next time you're in a conversation, just try to identify which type it is. Is it a, "What's this really about?" conversation, focused on a problem? Is it a, "How do we feel?" conversation, where someone needs empathy? Or is it a, "Who are we?" conversation, about identity and connection? Just identifying the type of conversation will instantly make you a better communicator. Or try this. The next time you ask someone a question, reframe it. Instead of asking a shallow question about a fact, like, "Where are you from?" ask a deep question about an experience or a feeling. What's the best thing about where you grew up? See how the energy of the conversation changes. Watch as it opens a door to a more meaningful connection. In a world that often feels polarized and lonely, the ability to truly connect with another human being is more valuable than ever. It's the foundation of strong families, successful teams, and healthy societies. It is, as the Harvard study shows, the foundation of a good life. That was a summary of Supercommunicators by Charles Duhigg. We've explored the core ideas today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary is like looking at a photograph of a magnificent landscape. You can see the shape of the mountains and the color of the sky, but you can't feel the warmth of the sun or the breeze on your skin. The real magic happens when you experience it for yourself. If any of the stories or ideas we talked about today sparked something in you, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. Reading it is an experience, one that can fundamentally change how you interact with every single person in your life. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to click that subscribe button. We journey through life-changing books like this one every single week, and I would be honored to have you join our community. Let's keep learning and growing together.